So we're starting the second part of our review for time period 4. So this is topic 8.5, decolonization, which is something we certainly talked about in class. Did anybody have any part of 8.5 for your review? Nobody? Okay. By the way, just to make sure, did everybody show me their review assignment on Friday? So nobody needs a grade from me right now. We all have it. Okay, awesome. So we talk about nationalist leaders and parties in Asia and Africa. So what that's saying is there's a lot of different paths to independence. They don't all follow the same pattern. For example, some of us where we have more white settlers, as we discussed in class, tend to fight back more ferociously, because even if the European power says, all right, we're out, we don't want to live in this place anymore, it's too much effort, we have other priorities after World War II, there might be white settlers whose families have lived in that country for 150 years. And so they've never been to Britain or France or the Netherlands. And we're going to see conflict between those white settlers who feel like this is their home and the native peoples of that colony who feel like it is not their home. And so sometimes it's just varying degrees of that. Non-settler colonies where we don't have a lot of white people who came and lived and moved to that country, that colony, they tend to be more business transactions. You sign a piece of paper, it's been real, and you go home. So that tends to be how it is. There's just variety of actions. We see nationalist leaders and parties on the left-hand side. We already mentioned Indian National Congress last week. So we'll talk about Kwame Nkrumah in the British Gold Coast, Ghana. Again, Mr. Nkrumah is the independence leader. He's the guy negotiating the process. He will then be elected as the first president of an independent Ghana in 1957. They are the first African colony to become independent after World War II. They were from the British. It's a relatively peaceful process. He is elected as president and then changes a couple years later the constitution to make himself dictator for life. And then he is overthrown by his country in that process. So we start as a democracy, and then we transition to dictatorial system after we change the constitution, and he is going to be removed from power forcibly. So there we see several patterns of that. But today, Ghana is a thriving democracy. That's not been their tradition over the last couple decades, but we see some African countries or Asian countries that are still dictators because they hold on to those processes after the independence process. And then we see negotiated independence. That's in the second one. I'll wait that. So some colonies negotiate their independence in the second one. Some have through fighting. Again, that depends on usually the number of white settlers or the colony or the European power and the colony leaders in that colony involved. So negotiated independence is India was the example we gave. India we know is a mess. The British are really trying to get out of there. The guy in charge of Britain at this point, the prime minister who's elected after World War II, campaigned on the promise of, I will get us out of our colonies. And so he's under a lot of pressure. This is a fabulously complex process. There's over 500 princes and rajas in India that have to be dealt with, not just the government who would be in charge. We also have, of course, the Muslim League wanting their own independent state, demanding what later is called Pakistan. We then have the British bring in a lawyer who has no official training in any concept of Indian Pakistani cultural history. He's not a geographer. He's not a scholar of the religion or culture of any of these people. And he is given 2 months to create a 1,000+ mile long line that's going to separate approximately 88 million people living on either side of that line. It is chaotic. It is poorly done. And it is announced one day in August, and literally the next day, 24 hours later, independence is achieved. So just because we're negotiated doesn't mean that it's done well. We talked about 1 million people die in the violence that occurs when this line is drawn, and we have approximately 14 million people crossing either way. Hindus going towards India, Muslims going towards Pakistan, all the anxiety and stress that results from that. It's chaotic at best and terrible and death causing for many people at worst. So that's one part of that. Armed struggle, a good example of that is Algeria. In the third example there in illustrative examples, Algeria was part of France, but the Algerians were considered to be French by the French government and people. It's very close geographically. I think that had something to do with it. And so the French were kind of caught off guard that the Algerians would want their own independence. Why wouldn't they just want to continue being part of us? It's very similar if you look at like Alaska or Hawaii. It's separated geographically, but it's part of our country. Why would they not want to be with us? And so there's an 8.5-year civil war. And finally in 1962, the Algerians win their independence from the French. All right. And then lastly, we have regional religious and ethnic movements are going to challenge some of these boundaries. It's often a messy process because who drew the boundaries again, kiddos? White Europeans. So did they always do a good job of settling those colonies up? No, of course they didn't. And so we already mentioned the Muslim League in British India. Part of that, we mentioned in class the Biafra secessionist movement in Nigeria. The Biafrans are the southern Nigerians, the Christians that control the oil supply, and they want to be separated from the Muslim north of Nigeria. And of course, they end up losing that civil war. And today we still have a united Nigeria. And then I would just like to say this one in the middle, the Québécois. The Québécois are the French Canadians. Of course, Canada was a French colony at one point, and then it was a British colony, so we still have that. There was several votes to have Quebec separate from the rest of Canada. One time the vote was less than 1% from achieving success, but they, of course, did not get that, and so today the Québécois are part of Canada. I just love saying that word. French sounds lovely, especially on a Monday morning. All right, so any questions on 8.5? In other words, colonialism and ending it is not as easy as it may seem. Or maybe it's just as chaotic as you thought it would be, which would make sense because it's involving millions of people in different cultures and governments. All right, 8.6, newly independent states on page 149. So the redrawing of political boundaries is going to have the creation of new states. A great example of that is, of course, Israel. Israel had not been created after World War I with the rest of the Middle East because the British don't know what to do with it. We, of course, have the Israelis who want to come to have their homeland from their religious and historical precedent. They've been kicked out 2,000 years earlier by the Romans. Of course, we have Palestinian Muslims, but also Christians living there for millennia plus who have not done anything to cause this situation. But after World War II and the Holocaust, the momentum really shifts to promote independence for the Israelis. And so we see the United Nations propose a split. It's actually 56% Israeli, 44% Palestinian. The Palestinians reject that outright. And we end up going to war. And as a result of that war, the Israelis win and then take 100% of the land. And that has been the case ever since. And so we have some still debate and hope that we can solve that problem. But as of now, there is no solution on the horizon to solve that problem. All right, and the bottom one, the redrawing of political boundaries in some cases leads to conflict, blah, 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 including, and we said conflict. So we already talked about both the partition of India. Partition is to divide. So we talk about partition, that's creating Pakistan and India in 1947, and the creation of Israel in 1948. So you have to know both of those examples. Why they also get an illustrative example, I have no idea, but you know, who am I to question the wisdom of the College Board? So on the back, page 150, governments that often take a strong role after World War II in promoting development because they have to. These countries are, if they're former colonies, they're poor. They were kept poor on purpose. They were not developed intellectually or industrially by their colonial masters because we want them to stay poor and need us. So that's very much an intentional process. And so we see that. For example, you see Gamal Abdel Nasser's promotion of economic development in Egypt. He is the first Egyptian-born leader of Egypt, a free, independent Egypt in over 2,000 years. He is the guy who nationalizes the Suez Canal. He's going to take over that canal from the British and the French and use it as a way to promote wealth for the Egyptians because you have to pay to go through that canal to go from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean. So it's going to bring financial benefits to the nation and people of Egypt. All right. We also see, this is an interesting one. We didn't get a chance to talk about this in class. The migration of former colonial subjects to imperial metropoles. That would be just big cities. So your nation is now independent. Your nation, though, is in poverty. Your nation is struggling with development. And so you, like many people throughout time, have moved for a better life, for a job. And so many of us are going to move, if we're in a former colony, to our colonizers' homeland. Why? We already know the language. And that's the most difficult part of most people in moving to a foreign country is learning the language. How do I get a job? How do my kids get educated? Of course, for kids, it tends to be easier to learn a language when you're younger. When you're older and you're trying to find work, that's much more difficult. And so we tend to move to our former colonizers' homeland because we already know the language and we already have a sense of the culture. And you see that impact with millions of people in some cases moving to those places. And for example, in Britain today, if you go for if in a couple of weeks when we get back to normal, if you go for a late snack with friends, you're probably going to go get a chicken tikka marsala, which is Indian food. That is the most common like snack food, comfort food we see in a place like Great Britain outside of fish and chips. So that shows you the impact of South Asians, first bullet point, to Britain. So millions of Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Indians moving to Britain, and now it's oftentimes the second or third generation of those families living in Britain. So that's a huge part of that culture. And it makes sense. Again, we tend to just, language is the hardest thing. So if we can get our, if we already know the language because we've been educated, we've been taught English, let's go there. In India, as the British colony, English was the official language of all government documents and all government meetings. So many people learn that language, and so it's much easier. Same thing for Algerians, even though they have a brutal civil war, we still know French. So it's a lot easier to go there and have a better opportunity for a life. All right, so there we go. Any questions on that one? Great. So then we go to 8.7, our penultimate one in topic 8, global resistance to establish power. So anybody have 8.7? I forgot to ask for 8.6, but nobody spoke up, so I assumed that I knew what the answer was. Get your yawns out, Megan. All right, so 8.7. Many states, we don't always see war and dominance. In fact, I'm listening to a book right now. I listen to Audible a lot. I don't read as much as I used to, but I do listen quite a bit. And it's basically saying that this is the most peaceful time we've ever had in terms of actual number of conflicts and people killed. It's a lot less per capita than it was 500 years ago. We have a media that often amplifies the negative because that's what people pay attention to, but there's, things are not as bad as we might seem them to be, especially in terms of armed conflict between different states. We're seeing a lot of international cooperation right now as people in various countries who have started to weather the storm of this virus are sending aid and sending equipment to countries that are still struggling in the depths of it. So that is something we have definitely seen. But there's also some wars that do happen. So you see on the right-hand side, responses that intensified conflict. Spain was a dictatorship under Francisco Franco. We covered that in class very briefly. He's a fascist. So he's very much similar in the vein of Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. And Franco will lead Spain. He takes over in 1936. And he will be in charge of that country till his death in 1975. So if you look at Spain, they don't join things like NATO or the European Union until the 1980s, once they have overthrown, or their dictator passed away, and then they democratize their government process. So that's an example of, we have a Spanish Civil War and then a fascist and the leader of Spain for almost 4 decades. All right, and then the second one, not everyone is going to be doing this. We have the massive movement towards nonviolent protest, and we see the big 3 listed there: Gandhi, Dr. King, and Nelson Mandela. Of course, Gandhi, they're listed in chronological order. Gandhi is the one who decides that fighting the British with pure force is not going to work, even though there are many more Indian people than British. The Indian people lack the technology the British do, and they're not going to win through violence. So he is going to go through nonviolent protest, marches, burning government ID cards as protests that only have to be carried by Native people, not by British people. And he brings the media along. He has newspaper reporters. He has photographers. Gandhi's a great interview, and he is going to get people to be there to take note of what's happening. And so you would see it in your newspaper the next day. And of course, for many of you, that's something you don't understand the impact of because you live in a much different world than they did. But the newspaper was pretty much how you got everything. This is before television. This is before even radio was common for a lot of people in the 1930s and 40s. And so therefore, newspaper was how you got that photograph of Gandhi sitting there getting beaten up is going to be a very powerful thing. Dr. King will use the same thing in the civil rights movement in the American South. Again, some of those images you've seen of people being attacked by dogs or having fire hoses turned on them simply for trying to eat in a certain restaurant or be able to apply for a certain job without discrimination. And then Mandela opposing the apartheid system in South Africa. He goes to jail for 27 years for standing up for his political beliefs of equality for his people. So that we do see some of that. All right. So the third one, militaries and militarized states respond with ways that conflict. This is, during the Cold War is when all this starts to happen. So it's a very aggressive time. A lot of us are using either violence or the threat of violence as a way to get what we want. So we have dictatorships that are military based. We have people threatening violence. We have civil wars, places like Vietnam, like Korea, coups, sometimes native coups, sometimes helped by foreigners like the United States who change the outcome of elections or certain political decisions we don't like. So there's examples of that all around the world. We've talked about several of those: Guatemala, Iran, Korea, Vietnam. I've mentioned Israel, Palestine several times, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and then lastly, some movements use violence against civilians to achieve political aims. So this by definition is extremist. These are people that will use violence to try to achieve their goals. And the example I will use is Al-Qaeda. We talked about Al-Qaeda briefly in class. Al-Qaeda is formed in the late 1980s by Osama bin Laden, who is the wealthy son of a billionaire road construction manager and company owner in Saudi Arabia. And he becomes radicalized and pushes very far to the right, where he believes that the only way to be a real Muslim is to practice a very strict and traditional conservative version of that faith. And so we got to get Western culture out of our lives. We also literally need the West to go away. They're oil company workers and eventually American troops in a place like Saudi Arabia preparing to invade Iraq in the early 1990s is immoral, and we must chase them out. And if they won't leave, then we have to threaten them with violence. And so that's what we see the rise of terrorism. Of course, Al-Qaeda, the perpetuators of 9/11, as I'm sure you're well aware. All right. And then lastly, any questions on that one? All right, 8.8. Anybody have the end of the Cold War? Most of y'all did yours on Friday, so not to be unexpected. Okay. So we see the end of the Cold War. We talked about this in a lecture I have posted on YouTube, a couple different reasons. Basically, the United States is going to spend a lot of money to get our military better. This is good for us for the most part. It's also bad for the Soviets because they try to keep up. And we just have a better economic base with a growing economy than the Soviets do. They end up spending a lot of money on the military, but they don't have money for pretty much anything else. Their society is rotting from within. The example I always give is, let's say you have a C in math and your parents say that's unacceptable. You will not get a C in math. You better bring that up. If you don't have an A by the end of the semester, they threaten you with whatever it is that you're scared to be threatened with, taking away certain privilege or opportunity you have or whatever. And so you focus really hard on math. You go to tutoring, you start doing your math homework every night, you are paying attention, you're asking your friends, and you ignore everything else. So yes, your math grade will go up. But what might happen to some of your other grades as well? They will go down. And so that's basically the Soviet Union. They get really good at math, aka military. Huge military, lots of nuclear weapons, all that stuff, excellent. What about the things for you and me, average people? What about schools? What about road systems? What about a lot of that stuff starts to fall apart because they really don't care about those other things because they're fixated on one goal and everything else starts to collapse, if that makes any sense to you. The invasion of Afghanistan, where they get stuck for almost a decade in a war that has no purpose outside of spreading communism and stopping potentially fundamentalist Islam from entering their country. And they can't defeat these guys. They have a lot of places to hide. They're very resourceful. It's a difficult environment to fight in, et cetera, et cetera. We also know that people are just frustrated and upset in the Soviet Union. We're starting to get more information from the West and from China comparing our lives to theirs, and their lives are better than ours. They're accomplishing more. They're doing better in a lot of ways, and we can't keep up. And so that's the broad strokes of what happens to help cause the end of the Cold War. We also know that their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, as again I said in the lecture on YouTube, tries to implement some reforms to give a little bit of freedom, a little bit of capitalism. And that doesn't happen because people, instead of being satisfied with a little, they want a lot. And so they don't want just a tiny little bit of freedom. They want a lot of freedom. And that is their biggest concern. Okay? Got it? So that's number 8, topic number 8. We will then move on to 9 if there are no objections. Sorry, Kristen, I lost you there for a second. It's almost like I get going and I get distracted, just like class. All right, we good? All right, let's move on to globalization, a subject of which you guys know quite a bit. We had a lovely discussion last Thursday about that I was very pleased with my first Zoom experience. We will start with 9.1. Anybody have 9.1?
I do.
Okay, go ahead. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So basically, new modes are of communication were air travel, were planes and shipping containers, were boats on water, and the internet and radio were phones and cellular communication. So everything all ideas and kind of everything kind of just globalized because people are able to share their ideas a lot easier. And it reduced the problem of geographic distance, which is basically just the distance between two objects. So yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, it's pretty simple stuff. I mean, right now is a hard time for everybody with the isolation and having to stay inside for the most part. But imagine if this was 15 years ago and we didn't have streaming. We didn't have FaceTime. We didn't have some of the things we have. Um, I did a FaceTime call on Friday night with 6 of my best friends from college. So, and we're in 5 different states right now. So that was really fun and really calming and really interesting. And that's something that literally couldn't have happened 10 years ago. So it's just, it's a difficult situation for us all, but we have a lot of technology that our predecessors didn't have. During the 1918 pandemic, I guess you just sat in your house and looked at each other. I don't know what else you did. So at least this gives us a little opportunity to get some outlet for communication and keeping up with people we care about, which would have been impossible for our ancestors. So that's kind of interesting. All right. Thank you, Max. Did you have other ones or just that first one?
Yeah, I had the next two.
Okay, go ahead, dude.
And so energy technologies were basically like TVs and like stuff that like have electricity and use energy, like lights and stuff. And then the use of petroleum and nuclear power of material goods were basically like bombs in the US, and oil, like petroleum could make oil and jelly. So
True.
that created a lot of other goods.
Well, yeah, but I mean, think about like the car. The reason that we have so much oil that has been so important in our lives the last 120 years is because of the rise of the internal combustion engine in the car. If a different kind of engine was used, we wouldn't really be caring about oil like 150 years ago, nobody really did. And when nuclear power, we're not talking about bombs, we're talking about actual nuclear power plants. Which is fine. But I mean, it's one of those things that nuclear power does not produce any waste. Now, of course, the concern is like in Japan a couple years ago when they had the earthquake and then the huge waves that crashed into the shore, one of their nuclear reactors, Fukushima, went offline. And so there was some nuclear meltdown. And so that area is going to deal with that for the next 10,000 years or so. So that's why some people have kind of gotten away from nuclear power because of the potential problems of all that nuclear waste. Chernobyl in the 80s, I don't know if y'all got to talk about that in chemistry class or not, but there was a nuclear explosion in Ukraine under the Soviet Union in the 1980s that showed a lot of the problems with nuclear power, but it is clean. It doesn't produce any negative effects for our atmosphere. So that is one way people look at it as a positive thing. All right. And then the third one, Max?
So basically preventing pregnancy, like women had greater control over it. And this kind of reduced the fertility rate because people were able to control. Because if during this time, the Great Depression and all the other stuff, kids cost money, and maybe if they didn't want a kid as much, they were able to control the birth rate and stuff like that.
Absolutely. The most prominent example of this is the pill, introduced in the 1960s. Yeah. And so that is drastically going to give women more opportunity. And so we start looking, especially in the industrialized world, at more women involved in the workplace. And so you could plan when to have your children, because for many women, it's a choice of, if I have a kid and I'm trying to enter a career, it's going to limit my options. So I want to establish myself in a career perhaps, and then choose to have children later in life if that's a choice I want to make. So we see more, when it talks about controlling fertility, that's part of it. And again, you look at the declining birth rates, demographic transition, that is also definitely part of it. The average woman has 1.6 children per woman in the industrialized world. So that's, and 100 years ago, that number was 4 or 5. So we're seeing a definite decline because of those things. All right, thank you, Max. Good job. Anybody have the rest of that by any chance? Okay, the fourth one down mentioned the Green Revolution. We talked about this in class briefly. This is the process that begins in the middle 20th century of massively increasing agricultural production. So we have access to things like fertilizer made in chemical factories, genetic engineering of crops to help them withstand drought or flooding, whatever the circumstance may be, new pesticides to help keep various insects or other creatures away from it. And so this is going to help us feed hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who probably would have starved to death otherwise. We see impacts, especially in a place like India, which has a massively undernourished population in the middle 20th century as they're dealing with independence, and who will live and get to grow up and become adults because of the benefits of the Green Revolution. So that's definitely part of it. All right, and then lastly, medical innovations. We start seeing massive inoculation and vaccination of kids when they're little. Things like measles, which used to kill thousands and thousands every year, and it's just not something we see very often. Whooping cough, et cetera, et cetera. Smallpox. The polio vaccine in the 1950s revolutionizes society. We hear about vaccines a lot as we're trying to figure out the coronavirus. and those kind of things. So it's definitely something that is part of that now. And then antibiotics. The first one is penicillin. Penicillin is discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. And so that is almost 100 years ago now. And so penicillin is the basis for many different drugs that are used to help combat different infections. Okay. All that stuff's pretty easy, I think. 9.2. Anybody have 9.2? Okay. So we know that diseases have major impacts on the world. I don't think I need to explain that right now. I think we all kind of got that one. And then you see the second one, disease. They have three categories of diseases: poverty, epidemic, and longevity. So with poverty, we see things like cholera. Cholera, as we know, we've talked about many times, is a disease you get from drinking water infested with fecal matter. If you have a modern industrial society with a sewer system, that just doesn't happen. The water is cleaned and treated, and so people don't get access to drinking water tainted with fecal matter. You still see cholera in countries that lack some of that infrastructure. So that's why it's called a disease of poverty, because it's a disease that people tend to get in places that are more poor. It's very simple. Epidemic diseases, clearly there's another one we could use, but Ebola is a good example. That it comes from Central Africa. It is a hemorrhagic fever, so you bleed from your orifices. It is one that thankfully is transmitted only through bodily fluids, so it is less able to spread than the coronavirus, which is pneumatic. In other words, can be breathed in. Those are the concerns there. And then when I was growing up, a little younger than you guys, the big topic was HIV and AIDS. I remember distinctly as a kid who loved sports where I was when the Los Angeles Lakers point guard Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive. We all thought he was going to die in a year. That's just what happened. I mean, and we laugh at these things now, or we're sad about them because people face discrimination. But I remember very distinctly hearing things like, if you touch something after someone who's had HIV touches it, you'll get it. If you sit in a toilet seat in public after someone has sat on there who had HIV, you'll get it. And those things are ridiculous, but we didn't know. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of panic and a lot of concern about stuff. And that was something I remember hearing very often as a child in elementary and middle school. And HIV is still a disease that is very harmful to people, but there are lots of drugs that can help combat the effects, and people live long, productive lives even after contracting it. And then the last one, speaking of long lives, longevity. As humans live longer than our ancestors, the average lifespan of people in industrialized societies increased 25 years in the last 120 years. It was in the mid 50s in around 1900, and now lifespans are late 70s. And so a huge part of that is better healthcare, better nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. Alzheimer's disease is one impact of that. As you tend to live longer, you have the greater chance of dementia, of having a decreased brain facility. My grandmother on my dad's side had Alzheimer's. So that's something I remember very distinctly with her illness and her struggle with that, and seeing what it did to her and the rest of my family. So it's something I'm sure many of us have similar experiences because it's something that people live longer. You're going to see more of that because at some point our bodies, we can take care of some part of it, but other parts are going to have challenges because we live longer. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, 9.3, environment. Anybody have that one? Okay, so we know that humans, having 7.5 billion of us, create environmental damage. That the planet can sustain us all, but we tend to be packed into certain places as opposed to being spread out because not all of the places on the planet that are land-based are good places to live for human consumption. So deforestation, cutting down rainforest, cutting down forest. We know Amazon, for example, that the rainforest and the forest are great places to take carbon as humans breathe carbon out. As we produce carbon with our vehicles and our other technology. The forests are called carbon sinks. They soak in that carbon since we know how plants breathe. And as we cut down those trees, that makes it harder for our planet to handle all the carbon we're putting out, and has led to some of the climate changes we've seen in the last 50 years. Desertification, as we start to build on the edge of deserts, as we start to do, take more resources and divert waters and dam things, that's going to have a change on that. And deserts in many cases are getting bigger every year. The Sahara is growing. As nutrients are taken out, that it turns into desert from like grassland. And then we see that humans are using a lot of water. There is a lot of water on this planet, but the vast majority, as I'm sure you know, comes from the ocean, and that is salt water and not something that humans can readily drink or other animals. And so there's not a whole lot of fresh water, and having to make sure that we resource, take better care of that and make a reference to that for people to use appropriately. And then the last one, greenhouse gases and pollutants. Greenhouse gases are those things that heat up the earth that don't escape the atmosphere easily. So things like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, which is naturally produced as well. So a lot of these products just are intensifying with more human activity, which I'm sure you understand. And I'm sure you also seen some pictures in the last couple of weeks. Like my favorite, I love Venice. It's a cheesy place, it's a touristy place, but it's a beautiful place. And to see, and having been to Venice multiple times, the water is always very murky. And now without the water taxis the last couple of weeks, the water is now clear. If you haven't seen these pictures, I'd encourage you to look at them. You can actually see to the bottom of the canals, and you can see fish swimming in them. There was a recent viral thing that there are dolphins there. That was actually made up. Somebody photoshopped that. True. There are no dolphins in the Venetian canals, but you can see fish, and you can see like actually the impact of human activity. Just a couple weeks without all those engines running in that water has cleaned it up. So it's amazing how resourceful and our planet can be when we take a little slow off. And if there's anything good about what's happened in the last couple of weeks, I think we can probably talk about that impact of a little less human activity and the positive changes we're seeing in our environment because of it. So if there's anything positive about that, that's certainly one thing I guess we could point to. All right, 9.4, economics, everybody's favorite. Anybody have any econ knowledge they want to share with us? 9.4, anyone? I'll take that as a no. All righty then. So we are seeing capitalism won. The Soviet Union loses, so communism is on the decline. Also, the Soviet Union was the sugar daddy of the communist world. They gave money to the Cubans. They gave money to the Vietnamese. So when the Soviet Union goes away, the faucet of money flowing into these countries dries up, and so their own decline is inevitable because they're no longer getting those checks every month, if you will. And so we're going to see the promotion then of capitalism and Western-style liberalization. The United States is a great example of that, but we also talked in class about China. Or we didn't talk about in class, it's on the video, and many of you, I'm sure, watched that first video. China in the late 1970s, after the death of Mao, we see the rise of a guy named Deng Xiaoping. And Mr. Deng is going to be promoting basically capitalism. Now, today, technically, we would call China a mixed economy. They still have large businesses, in many cases owned by the government, but they have thousands and thousands and thousands of private ones. They have a stock market. They have a lot of investment. These are things that you don't see in a communist society. And because of this, China's economy has blossomed over the last 4 decades. They've drastically reduced the number of people in poverty. They've become the world's manufacturing center, et cetera, and all of which you probably know. And today they're the second biggest economy in the world after our own in this country. And that, 45 years ago, they were probably number 100 or so. And so they've rapidly increased because of their turn towards capitalism as an economic principle. All right. And capitalism is not perfect. It certainly has its problems, but it does produce more opportunity than other systems. It's like democracy. Democracy has its problems too, but it's better than the alternative. At least most people would argue that. All right. So we see the second one, information technology. This is all IT stuff, everything online, all those kind of revolutions, how they've changed our lives. We have so-called knowledge economies. And so you look at a place like Japan. They don't produce a lot of manufacturing, but they have a lot of the companies that produce the ideas, and then their cars or their technology is produced in another place cheaper and then shipped out to the rest of the world with a Japanese company name on it. So Nintendo, Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Honda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we talk about knowledge economies, or they also train a lot of people. Tens of thousands of students every year from foreign countries come to the United States for an education, and then many will go back to their home countries when they finish. And so they can take that knowledge they gain in our universities and go help their countries produce more opportunities. So that's what we mean by knowledge economy. We see the manufacturing centers of the world become in Asia and Latin America. So a great example of that, Bangladesh produces a lot of cheap clothes, t-shirts and socks and underwear and whatnot. Bangladesh is a rather impoverished nation. It used to be called East Pakistan, and then has a civil war in 1971, becomes independent, the nation of Bangladesh. It has often one of the world's highest rates of population density. It's a country very small, about half the size of Texas, yet they have almost 200 million people in that country. So that's quite a lot of people in a small area. And many of them therefore work for pennies, basically making cheap goods for more powerful, richer nations like our own. Latin America, again, Honduras is a place in Central America that makes a lot of cheap clothes. A lot of t-shirts are made in Honduras, that kind of thing. So same idea. It's a way to provide a basic income for their people. And also the rich world wins because they're getting cheap goods that they pay less for if they're made in their own country. All right, the last one on page 163, we see a lot of different changes in the global economy, people starting to interact more, people starting to work together more. So the economic institutions and regional trade agreements, we mentioned NAFTA in class, how that was an example of a free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And while that's had an overall economic benefit, it's certainly cost thousands of American workers their jobs as factories moved to northern Mexico, maquiladoras, to pay their workers less and then cross the American border with no tariff. And so we can still ship those goods to Americans rather cheaply. So there has been some definite negative impacts on certain workers, especially in the industrial sector. And then we have literally the World Trade Organization. That's an organization that is meant to just make sure that we are being fair and equal in our trading practices. We don't show favoritism, that everyone has a chance at an open market to trade their goods for a reasonable price. Also, multinational corporations. You see Nestle there. Nestle is the world's largest food company. It's based in Switzerland. I know this because at one time or another, both of my brothers have worked for Nestle. One still currently does. So he helps sell food to restaurants. So that's something that they are in all kinds of stuff. You think of Nestle, you think of chocolate probably, if you think of anything, hot chocolate, etc. But any kind of food pretty much Nestle makes. They also own Ralston Purina, which if you have an animal in your house right now, a dog especially, they might make the dog food that you have in your house. So they make not only human food, but also animal food. So that's an example of multinational corporation. Closer to home, Yum Brands is definitely a multinational corporation based right here in our own beloved Louisville, Kentucky. All right. So we're halfway through number 9. So we'll move on to 9.5. Any of you lovely folks have 9.5?
I have the last point of 9.5.
Okay, well,
I have the first 2.
Hey! All right, so
Yes.
good, more from you all. I'll eat more cereal. Go ahead.
Okay, so for the first one, rights-based discourses challenge old assumptions. People are starting to say that more people are equal, like women can do just as much as men, and blacks are equal. And an example, I chose a global feminism movement, and just as I said, women are saying they are treated equal as men and have same opportunity in jobs, no prejudices, and they can vote, have same rights as men. Okay. And then for the next one, access to education as well as participation in political and professional roles. So more people can go to school worldwide, vote, and have good jobs no matter ideologies, race, or any of that. An example, I chose into the apartheid, and so like they denied non-white participation in government and limited activities of non-white labor unions and could not interact with whites.
Where was that, Sebastian?
South Africa.
Good. Yeah. And it only ended that was in my lifetime, 1994. Yeah. So relatively recent. Yeah. Okay, good. Any questions from anybody? And we talked about several of those examples in there, but the 2 examples Sebastian picked were great, so that's good. All right, how about movements, Soleila?
So like one of the movements for environmental, I chose the Greenpeace movement, and that, like, we've talked about that, but the organization was mainly to like preserve endangered species, but also sort of like help the environment globally. And one of sort of the, I guess, examples that came from that was that, like, in London there was a high like a very concentrated lead and gas that was being used, and the smog was very harmful, and it ended up like hurting or killing like about 4,000 people in London because of like the killer fog. And so like overall the Greenpeace movement, sorry, my phone is ringing. Hold on, give me a second.
Okay. I'll step in while it's popular. Soleila does that. You all, if you ever look at a gas station, it always says unleaded. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. Any reason why it's called unleaded?
That never rains, so I am so sorry.
Yeah, you're super popular. I'm going to finish my point though.
That's
because gas used to have lead in it. You used to put lead. Do you know anything about lead as an element? Anybody?
Huh?
You know anything about lead?
It's hot. It's not good to like have to consume.
Poisonous. So that's why you don't have paint and all that kind of stuff. So we used to put that in our cars, and then our cars would belch that out, and so it made us dumber. When they took lead out of gasoline about 40 years ago, national IQ test for kids in school literally went up about 2 or 3 points. We literally got smarter because we stopped poisoning our kids. So that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway,
And
go
then,
ahead.
for the economic movement, the World Fair Trade Organization, and that was mainly used to like promote equal rights and then like create good conditions for trading. So like they sort of used it was used to like enforce or encourage a change and fight against like poverty, climate change, and just like poor conditions overall for trading.
Yes, very good. And I'm sure you all been to businesses where they talk about fair trade, oftentimes in coffee. Like if you go to, what's the local coffee? Honey Brothers, can't even think of it. They talk about fair trade coffee. That's what they're referencing, is that you're allowing people to compete, not just the big multinational corporations swallowing it up. All right, good. Thank you. So Layla, do you have one on the next page as well, or is that just it?
That was it.
Wow, okay.
I know.
9.6. Anybody have that one? Okay, 9.6. We see lots of different changes in the arts, and we have globalization of culture as well. So we look at just, television, movies, the internet, streaming, all the things have changed the way we consume media, what we do with our free time, how we access information. Again, about 3 years ago, I switched to a company called Audible, which is through Amazon. And so you listen to books, because I just wasn't reading a lot. I had book stack and because I read for a living. I read your all's work. And I found myself, as I got older and had more things to do, that I was not reading as much as I used to. When I switched to Audible, I now listen to books. And I know there's some great debate about, do you really read a book if you listen to it? I don't really care. But I have actually listened to more books in the last 2 years since I switched than I read in probably the previous 10. Because I'm in the car a lot, and I'm traveling, and I'm getting ready in the morning, and I'm, brushing my teeth before I go to bed or whatever I do. Whereas I'm tired of reading, because that's what I do for a living half the time. I'm much more likely to listen. So that's an example of how that's probably not an example for many of your lives, because I doubt you're heavy into audiobooks, but maybe you are. I have no idea. But it's, the things we can get off YouTube and all those other aspects that weren't even a part of your parents' lives or my lives are now a huge part of yours. The second one, arts, entertainment, globalized pop culture. We have several examples I mentioned in class. You see reggae music, Bollywood movies from India, World Cup soccer, the Olympics, which look now increasingly now like they're going to be delayed a year. Hopefully by July we're all good. But the thing that you think, oh my gosh, July they're canceling stuff. No, it's not that. It's that you're an athlete. You're the best in the world at whatever it is that you do. Can you train right now? No. How are you going to have the biggest competition of your life in 3 months without training for a month, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is, before you have to compete? That's pretty much, so that's what it's not so much right now that they're scared this will still be a huge problem in July. It's they're scared that you're going to get a bunch of people there who aren't ready to go because their lives are so regimented and structured. Because to be the best in the world at something, that just doesn't happen. You have to work and work and work at it. So my assumption is we'll announce that we're going to postpone the Summer Olympics to 2021 here in the next couple of weeks. I think that's and they should do that, because it's not so much that we're still scared of the illness by then. It's that these people have worked their whole lives for something, and they need to be able to do their preparation to do their best at it. All right, and then global consumerism. You see some examples there. Online commerce, Alibaba. I'll just mention that one since you may not know that one. Alibaba is basically the Chinese Amazon. And actually, their founder, Jack Ma, announced last week he is shipping masks and gowns and like medical equipment all over the world as like a goodwill gesture. Now, if you're a cynic, you're saying, well, he's doing so to raise the global profile of his company. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, that's probably good business, but he's also doing it because he's helping people in need. So I'm going to try to not be cynical and say, guys, doing it to help do that. But he is basically the Jeff Bezos of China, if you will. To Alibaba, that corporation is. And then Coca-Cola. If you've ever been to Atlanta, they have the World of Coca-Cola down there, and they have all the different variants, and it's fascinating. It truly is. It is something that random people all over the globe would see that logo and know what it means. And there are very few truly, like Golden Arches is another one that you would see and know what it is no matter what country you live in. All right, 2 left. 9.7, resistance to globalization. Not everybody is going to be happy with this. Not everybody wants to have identical culture forced upon them from foreign sources. And so, for example, the first one, the anti-IMF and anti-World Bank activism, those are international organizations that lend money to poor countries for projects or do whatever, but they also restrict what they can do with it. Again, if you're going to take somebody's money they are going to have a say in how you spend it. And so there have been protests around the world for people opposed to some of the regulations that have been imposed by Western nations if they're going to donate money to people. And the other one is, I think it's interesting, the locally developed social media, Weibo, is basically almost like Instagram/Twitter in China. So it's very popular. There are hundreds of millions of subscribers, but it also is living in an environment where the Chinese government censors a lot of content. So they have very strict posting rules about what you can say about the Chinese government. They have thousands and thousands and thousands of people that monitor posts, and they will take anything down and lock your account if you oppose the Chinese government. So that's something that in a dictatorship does limit the aspect of their social media. Okay, so anyway, the last one, 9.8. We have new international organizations, and the example they give us, of course, is the United Nations. Goal is to create peace. We know they do many other things. Quite possibly the most important part of, and I would say not quite possibly, definitely right now, part of the United Nations umbrella is the World Health Organization, as they try to spread information and help combat the coronavirus pandemic, to make sure that people, if something's working someplace, that they get that idea spread to somewhere else. So that is period 4. So again, to be clear, does anybody have any questions, by the way?